Good afternoon to you. I hope you and your family are doing well. Pastor Stecker here with Grace Lutheran Church here in Nashua, New Hampshire, as we continue our Bible study here on Paul the Apostle. And today we're looking at chapter 10, Paul's time spent in Corinth and what he does while he's there. Happy Wednesday. After Paul's adventure in Athens, he moves to the city of Corinth, where he spends around 18 months. There he finds great success, and he writes his second epistle letter, which is his first letter to the church in Thessalonica, known to us as 1 Thessalonians. As we study this stage of Paul's life, we will see the challenge that he faced in preaching about a crucified and risen Messiah. We will also see in both his life in Corinth and his letter to Thessalonica, three areas that Paul constantly focuses on when speaking about the Christian life. Here we should better understand what some of the principles are in the early church and what should be staples of our church today. After this, we will take a look at an interesting topic, one called Eschatology, or the study of the last things or the end times, to the fulfillment of things to come. This word played an important role in Paul's message to his audience. While it certainly challenged the worldview of the entire Gentile world, it is also something that often gets taken out of context for us today. So by looking at what is going on in Paul's world, we should better understand how we understand God's promise to bring healing to his creation and how that affects our life today. Wright points out that thanks to Paul, we know more about the city of Corinth than any other first century city in Greece. While we usually look at the Bible for spiritual guidance, theology, and moral advice, it's always interesting to remember that in our hands, we hold one of the best historical documents ever written. In books such as Acts, we have historical narratives telling us about events that took place. And in books such as 1st and 2nd Corinthians, we have heartfelt letters dealing with real social and communal issues, showing us what challenges faced the early first century communities. So, what was Corinth like? Well, it was as lively as it was lascivious. Paul shows us an energetic city with stark class distinctions, lively pagan temples, thriving marketplaces, brothels, high numbers of slaves, big dinner and wedding parties, and continual festivals. In all reality, this is probably a pretty good example of what many wealthy cities in the old pagan world looked like before Christianity spread and changed the Western world forever. One of the main focal points for us is that Corinth was known for its lack of morals. They had an order of law, courts, judges, etc., but their moral scruples were very low. For example, one of their main temples were to the god of Aphrodite, a goddess of love and sexuality, but we'll get to that more later. In addition to this, most of the wealth was concentrated in a very wealthy elite, with most of the populace poor and about half of them enslaved. All of that said, the city was known for its strong economy, as it was on the isthmus separating the northern from the southern regions of Greece. So it was a prosperous trading town, which meant that most members had opportunities to acquire wealth if they worked hard and got to know the right people. All of this left an intriguing culture and situation for Paul's arrival. In Paul's letter to the church in Corinth, he says, "I came to you in weakness, in great fear and trembling." This reminds us that when he arrives in the city, he didn't roll in on a war horse or a flashy car with a new marketing campaign. He has recently been beaten in Philippi, and he would have been ragged and dirty from his 3 days on the road, most likely alone. He was most likely also low on funds and would have been anxious about some of the riots and threats against himself and some of his Christian friends in areas like Thessalonica. But here he rolls in, and he does his normal routine of preaching in the synagogue and engaging both Jews and Gentiles with the message of Jesus as Messiah, and how he has come to fulfill the Old Testament scriptures. Soon he meets Aquila and Priscilla, a Jewish couple who had moved to Corinth from Rome and would later travel with Paul to Ephesus. They too were tent makers and seemed to grow a strong kinship with Paul. All of this should help us see the great challenge Paul had at delivering his message in new areas. When he entered a new city, he was not an attractive sight. He also wouldn't have any friends. And just think for a moment about his message. He was teaching that the Gentile way was wrong, but that the Jewish way had been utterly changed forever due to the fulfillment of their scriptures and their way of life. A fulfillment that was accomplished through a crucified and risen Messiah. Most people probably thought that he was insane, out of his mind, or at worst, blaspheming or trying to start civil unrest against the Greco-Roman way. It is only with great faith that the Spirit was at work through him that he could continue on and face the unknown in city after city. This may be something hard for us to imagine because almost everyone we encounter has some notion of what Christianity is, some familiarity, even if it is wrong or confused. But for Paul, he was proclaiming a completely unique message, drenched in Jewish tradition, but with a new twist. Imagine proclaiming something that utterly radical in town after town where you don't know anyone, at least from the start. Soon after Paul's arrival in Corinth, Timothy arrived, bringing news from Thessalonica. The news was good and encouraging for Paul. The church was thriving and holding fast despite persecution. They had not given in to hardships. He was now overflowing with joy. The fruits of his hard work and labor were paying off right before his eyes. He had not spent much time there, but the vision was working. The church was living out their calling even in the face of danger and persecution. Paul writes to them saying, "When our Lord Jesus is present once more, what is our hope, our joy, the crown of our boasting before him? It's you. Yes, you are our glory and our joy." Paul then set to writing his letter to the church in Thessalonica. His writing would have been influenced both by his news from Timothy and from his own experience in Corinth. We will take a look at two important matters Paul touches on that he is eager to teach. It looks as though these are issues that were bound to come up as they were so radically different than the worldview all around them. The three issues that Paul touches on adamantly is 1, sex, 2, money, and 3, the appearing of Jesus. We'll focus on the first two here, and then we'll touch on the third in the next section where we learn about eschatology. The first two, they may seem obvious to us, but it's important for us to remember that Paul's teaching on sex and money aren't peripheral for him. They are central to his understanding of what a Christian life is. Wright sums up the importance of the Christian sexual ethic in this way. Sexual holiness is mandatory, not optional, for followers of Jesus. What that means in practice, Paul will later spell out in his first letter to Corinth. But already the reason for this rule is made clear. Unbridled, crazy, and inflamed lust is a sign that one does not know God. Sexual holiness isn't just a rule, an arbitrary command. It is part of what it means to turn from idols and serve the true and living God. It is part of being a genuine, image-bearing human being. Here we see an important truth for us to remember. Paul doesn't see his teaching on sexuality as something which is just an arbitrary command from God. It's not just that God thinks it's bad when it's done in the wrong context, which would be anything outside of a marriage relationship. But in fact, it's in a different category than other moral commands and guidelines. See, in paganism, which is what the whole world was outside of Judaism, sexuality was part of the worship life. See, it was understood in the ancient world, whether by Jew or Gentile, that whatever one has sexual relations with, there is a bond that's deeper than the physical. It was something that was connected to the spiritual level. That is why pagan temples often had brothels, because people were called to join themselves physically as well as spiritually to those employed at the temple. And in doing so, they were connecting themselves to the pagan deities. Now here's the thing, they weren't entirely wrong. Paul is warning against sexual immorality, not because he thinks that the pagan ways were simply trivial or misguided, but because he understood that by engaging in those exercises, one was worshiping these dark idol gods and giving themselves over to lust, which corrupted the human heart. This is why Paul adamantly opposed sexual immorality. Part of turning to the one true living God was turning from promiscuity and toward faithfulness, both in worship life and in sexual life. Secondly, Paul deals with the issue of money. In the same way, money was used for bribing in the pagan religions. One would make sacrifices to the pagan gods in order to bribe them into blessing them. Paul was noting that all of this leads to great greed and an insatiable focus on self. To combat this, both on the personal and the spiritual level, Paul promoted charity. But as much as Paul spoke about giving to others, especially those who are in need, Paul also spoke against freeloading. He says that Jesus' followers must behave in a way which outsiders will respect. This included both charitability and also combating where people would take advantage of that charitability. Paul's instructions here are straightforward. He says those who won't work shouldn't eat. The key takeaway from this section is to note that Paul understands that morality is something which is multifaceted. God calls us to obey him in all things, and he certainly offers forgiveness through Jesus where we fail and come up short. But Paul understands that there are certain things in life which are much more dangerous than others, sex and money being two primary focuses. This is because the way one treats these things are directly connected to dark pagan worship. As Wright says elsewhere, when people worship these dark powers, they give them power that they aren't supposed to have. And those who engage in the worship become enslaved to those dark powers that they're giving power to. Paul is aware that when people engage in these potent, sinful lifestyles, that it is highly addictive, quite damaging, and that it is a return to a pagan-style worship that orients one towards these dark powers and away from the one true God. This is why Paul exhorts the church in Thessalonica, Corinth, and elsewhere to turn from those practices and seek forgiveness and healing. This is something which is important for the church of today to remember. There are many denominations, ours is not one of them, thanks be to God, who have turned their back on Paul, Jesus, and the Bible's teaching about sexuality. One denomination in particular has preached openly against teen chastity. These are serious issues, not minor disagreements. They are opening the door and advocating for their own people to return to the dark and dangerous ways which Paul so adamantly preaches against. See, Paul sees the turning from these ways as one of the healthy highlights of the church. It is freeing people from those dehumanizing and enslaving practices. And the church of today must recognize and not turn from those fundamental and important teachings, lest they cease to be the church. Last, we will touch on an important teaching of Paul, one which would have been completely foreign to the Gentile world, and that is eschatology. Wright notes that the non-Jewish world did not have a sense of eschatology, which is a sense of time going somewhere, a sense of history having an ultimate purpose that would eventually be realized. For the Jew, and even more so for the Christian, all of history was moving toward an ultimate purpose. Paul uses 3 different images to help us understand this point. First, Paul recalls Moses coming down the mountain accompanied by the trumpet, suggesting that Jesus will be appearing in a similar fashion. Now, Paul is not here supposing that this means that Jesus will be literally descending on a 3-dimensional plane, but rather that Jesus would be coming here to earth for his final appearance. Second, he recalls the image from Daniel 7, where one like a son of man coming with the clouds from earth to heaven, vindicated at last after suffering, exalted to the place of sovereign rule and kingdom. Wright notes that those who belong to the Lord will be exalted like that. They will share in the throne of the Lord. Third, he recalls what happens when an emperor visits a city. The living citizens go down to meet him and escort him into the city. This will be the same for those who are awaiting Jesus' coming. They will be looking for him and ready to escort him in. Wright then notes, like that, those who are alive, he says, will meet the Lord in the air. How else can he describe the coming together of heaven and earth? The point is not that people will be snatched away from earth and end up in heaven. As we see frequently in his letters, that is never Paul's view. The point is that heaven and earth will come together, and those who belong to the Messiah will be part of it. The one literal statement in this text is the central and important one. The Messiah's people, who have already died, will rise first. Those who have died while believing in Jesus are safe in his presence, and they will be raised when he appears. Then all these other things will happen too. Here we see that Paul sees the coming together of heaven and earth, with heaven healing the earth as the ultimate direction and fulfillment. He saw this as beginning with the coming of Jesus, where heaven and earth met together in his own flesh. And now, through his death and resurrection, he has established his church, where his Spirit will go out into the world. This is the job of the church. Paul sees God as working through him and through the church to help bring these things to be. And finally, Jesus will come again, raising all who have fallen asleep in him. And then the final reign of heaven will begin. This ends our study for today, where we looked at the topics of Paul's letters to the Thessalonians and also his life in Corinth. After 18 months, he departs from Corinth with Priscilla and Aquila and crosses the Aegon to Ephesus, then back to Jerusalem and quickly back to Syrian Antioch. Next week, we will look at his time in Asia Minor and Ephesus in particular. Thank you for joining us. We hope all of you have a wonderful day, and we also invite you to join us tomorrow, Thursday at 1 p.m. for our Zoom discussion about this Bible study. Take care. God bless.